All right, we're going to talk about Lord Byron's closet drama, Cain. A mystery is what it is called. Um, and in the context of our course here on the romantic epic, and I briefly drew your attention in the last lecture to, I thought, what was necessary information in order to approach this epic and understand Byron's place in the context of the course, because he, to a large degree, deviates from the precedent set by the Wordsworthian model, probably in the same sort of way that Shelley did. And we already mentioned both Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley's emendation or adaptation of the romantic hero, in Mary's case, by placing the romantic hero in the guise of Victor Frankenstein, or one could say the hero of Frankenstein is actually the creature, the monster, who is a sort of a Byronic hero in his own right. Or in Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, where again the figure seems to be a tortured sort of soul who has suffered terrible wrong at the hands of the gods, or in that case of Jupiter, and in the end reciprocates, not with the same sorts of hatred that he has been visited with, but rather by forgiving or pitying the torturing god. Now, Byron plays on these same themes by using a Byronic hero, unsurprisingly, because, of course, Byron is himself the man who comes up with the portrait of such a hero throughout his fiction. And we can see that in its early beginnings in not only his works, so we see it in his semi-autobiographical epic narrative, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which launched his literary fame, but also in works like Don Juan and Sardanapalus, and other works like Manfred, but certainly also here. And in general, the romantic, or rather the Byronic hero, was described by the great English historian Lord Macaulay as, and I'll quote here, "a man proud, moody, cynical, with defiance on his brow and misery in his heart, a scorner of his kind, implacable in revenge, yet capable of deep and strong affection." This seems to me to be accurate, but it leaves out the one feature which I think draws us to these characters. It's not so much the profile of psychology, which is to some degree that of a melancholic figure, a brooding, dark character like a Hamlet, but in addition, a commitment to justice. And justice as opposed to the law. And this is the feature, I think, of romantic, of the Byronic hero, that not only is present in Byron's works that makes them so attractive, but allows that Byronic hero to remain a portrait of a certain type of figure in literature thereafter. And I gave a variety of illustrations of that in our class, everything ranging from Byron's own works all the way on up to the present, where we have the fighters for justice who are willing to break the law in order to embrace justice or to pursue justice. And the Dark Knight himself, Batman, is, of course, an obvious illustration in contemporary terms. But for now, let's look at Byron's work itself. And as I said at the outset, it is called by Byron himself a mystery. And it's a mystery because, and Byron himself explains this in the introduction to it, as opposed to a miracle or a moral play. And these are different types of plays that are cast in the medieval period. They were mystery plays, there were morality plays, and there were miracle plays. But this one's a mystery, and mystery plays tended to focus upon an episode in biblical history. And there were several mysteries plays, many of which have been lost, but mystery plays dedicated to the figure of Abel. Byron, of course, is going to juxtapose his mystery play to the faithful accounts of the mystery, or mysterion in the Greek, from which we derive this word mystery, by focusing rather on Cain. And in focusing on Cain, of course, he's actually following up his role model here, or to some degree the most important literary influence on this work, namely Milton in his Paradise Lost. So Milton in his Paradise Lost gives us an account of the first 3 chapters of Genesis, largely actually Genesis 2 and 3. Not much is told of Genesis 1. We get Genesis 2, and in particular Genesis 3, a sort of a synopsis of what we also get in Revelation 12, by the way. If you put those two together, you more or less have the context for Paradise Lost. Byron chooses to follow that account of Paradise Lost, Milton's account, with the follow-up to what happened. What happened next? Well, what happened next was that Adam and Eve had 2 children, the one of which slew the other. The elder brother murdered the younger. And Abel is presented as a hero of the faith who had faith in God, whereas his brother did not. But Byron has different purposes in presenting his Cain. This is later on in Byron's life. This is 1821 when he writes this. He's now an established figure, a literary figure. He's writing from the continent of Europe, and having been banished from England effectively by his notorious conduct, in particular his much speculated on affair with his half-sister Augusta Leigh, or Augusta Lee, who is I think implicitly referred to in the novel at various, or in the novel in this closet drama Cain at various points, by the references to an incestuous relationship between Cain and his sister Ada. So I think Byron is repeatedly going back to cover the same sort of ground that brought him his notoriety to begin with, namely his violation of the law in order to pursue nature, and to pursue love. And he presents it here in this form. And once again, he says that it's got nothing to do with biography, and he's not making a comment on biblical matters either, but most plainly the context makes it clear that he's doing both, at least to some degree. And his publisher, John Murray, for his pains, was threatened and with censorship for bringing this out, because of course the the publication of this closet drama brought a great deal of backlash from the establishment in Britain at this point. The other thing that needs to be brought to attention in this is his reference to the work of Cuvier. Now, Georges Cuvier, for his part, is a French naturalist and a zoologist of the day. And some even will go so far as to call him the founding father of paleontology. Very important, influential figure in natural sciences research in the early 19th century. So very, very important figure, comparing living animals with fossils and so forth. And expanding on this sort of taxonomy of Linnaeus and categorization and so forth. His work is, most famous work is on the theory of the earth, written in 1813. Byron obviously has some acquaintance with this. The reason I mention all of these things as we go through Cain, it's clear, while the setting here is the biblical period, Byron is not only engaging with his own currently infamous biographical affairs in the relationship between Ada and Cain, but also commenting on contemporary anthropology and so forth. And interwoven into all of that is the problem of the consequences of the fall and the perceived injustice in the play. So when we meet Cain right at the outset of the play, I keep calling it a play, but it is, as I said at the outset, it is a closet drama that it is not meant to be performed. Nonetheless, when you read it, you can see that it is set up in the form that we would read a play, but it would be impossible to actually put this on stage. You might manage to be able to do it in cinema because of the setting. But the play begins with Cain and as a very angry man. And the root of his anger has numerous threads to it. So he's angry at God for planting the tree of knowledge in the middle of the garden. He is angry at his mother for having taken fruit from the tree of knowledge, following the temptation of the serpent. He's mad at his father, Adam, for not taking fruit from the tree of life as well. And he's upset with his brother Abel for not being as angry about the whole situation as he is. The main source of the anger behind all this is the apparent injustice, the terrible injustice, that although God is said to be all-powerful and all-knowing, he has nonetheless caused Cain a great deal of harm. In fact, he's condemned him to death. And this, according to Cain, is an injustice. Because after all, he did none of these things. He is being visited with the consequences of others' actions rather than his own, and this is unjust. So the charge here is that justice is being undermined by God's actions. So he is fundamentally unjust. That's the beginning of that's the whole moral thrust of the work. And in the same way that Shelley and Blake and many of the other Romantic authors are interested in exploring ethical consequences of Milton's Paradise Lost, likewise Byron is also seeing it primarily in terms of ethics, and with the problem and the presentation of God as primarily an unjust figure because of these things. The claim, and there are various claims being made throughout this, but one of them is that God destroys as much as he creates. So why do we speak of him as a creator? This seems to be, at the very least, flattering, and more probably inaccurate entirely, at least from the vantage point of Cain. Likewise, the claim is being made, and it's made not only by Cain, but also by Satan, that God, even the creative aspects of God are overstated, because the only reason he does create is to relieve his own solitary tyranny. So God is presented in unflattering terms, and his rationale for creation, far from being good, seems to be totally undermined by his judgment on mankind and condemnation of them to death. So God is a tyrant. He is not only unloving, he is unjust. Those are the charges. In response to that, we could say that the portrait that Byron provides here is simply theologically inaccurate. He's not understood Milton's Paradise Lost, let alone Christian theology on this. In terms of the last point, God is portrayed as a being of three persons, in his nature loving, and experiences eternal love before he creates anything. He does not create out of a need to be loved, but rather out of his grace and his goodness, and for no other reason. There is no motivation per se, nothing that prompts or forces God to act as he has. He does so surely out of his own, solely out of his own goodness, but not because of any sense of need in him to be loved in return. So that's the first thing, and I think it's not an insignificant thing. The second thing is the idea that God destroys as much as he creates. There is something that is to be granted in this. God is capable of destruction. On the other hand, when he destroys, what is meant by evil? What is the understanding of evil that Shelley and Byron both operate under? And it is in terms of a negation, or really an opposite sort of force to that of good. And in that, they are ignoring the theological underpinning of Christian theology that we can see Milton clearly does understand, namely that evil is the absence of good, or the privation of the good. So it's being deprived of something, rather than being an entity unto itself. But in general, the portrait in both Byron and in Shelley discounts those things. But the main thrust here, as I say, is the sense of injustice on behalf of, on Cain's behalf, against God. He's angry. He's angry at the injustice of it all, and he is arguing and acting as if he were just in defying such a tyrannous entity as the God that Milton describes. Of course, Milton is not described. So we begin in Act 1, and I'm just going to, here in this video, I'm going to talk about Act 1 and not deal with the later acts, which will follow. I'll deal with them in the subsequent lectures, Acts 2 and 3. But in Act 1, we begin with Cain refusing to follow the example of Adam and Eve and Abel and Ada and Zillah. The names Ada and Zillah being the first female names mentioned in Scripture. They're actually associated with Lamech's wives, and not here, but Byron uses them here and gives them these names to his sisters for his own purposes, obviously. But it does raise the question: where does, if there's no mention of females, where do they come from? Surely they must be his sisters, and surely they must be. But Adam, Eve, Abel, Ada, and Zillah all praise God for his creation and all that he has done for them, whereas Cain remains silent. And Adam asks him the question, "Son Cain, my firstborn, wherefore art thou silent?" Verse 22. And Cain's response is, "Why should I pray? To pray. Why should I speak, rather?" And Adam's response is, "To pray." "Have ye not prayed?" says Cain. Adam, "We have, most fervently." "And loudly," says Cain. "I have heard you. So will God, I trust." Abel says, "Amen." "But thou," says Adam, "my eldest born, art silent still. 'Tis better I should be so." "Wherefore so?" says Adam. Cain says, "I have naught to ask, nor ought to be thankful for." "No." "Dost thou not live?" says Adam. Cain's response, "Must I not die?" "Alas," says Eve, his mother, "the fruit of our forbidden tree begins to fall." So there's an immediate understanding on Eve's part that the fall, which they had been spoken of in Genesis 3, is evident now even in the response of Cain to the opportunity to praise God. But it begins the whole closet drama with the main problem that Cain has with God, namely that he is condemned to die, not for his own actions, but rather for the actions of his parents. And so there's a perceived injustice in that response. And so Adam and he go back and forth a little bit, and there's various really interesting dialogues. I do think this is quite an excellent work of literature. However theologically problematic it might be, however much he might misunderstand and misrepresent Christian truth on this, or the biblical account, or even Milton's account, all the same. I think he's a brilliant writer. And Cain asks then, Adam is upset at Cain's response, and sort of calls out, and "O God," he calls out, "why didst thou plant the tree of knowledge?" And Cain to him, "And wherefore plucked ye not the tree of life? Ye might have then defied him." Defied him. Well, defied him in what sense? Well, defied in the sense of having not being subject to the sentence of death that then ensues. Now, of course, for a Christian, the response to this is the reason that God removed them from the Garden of Eden and the possibility of eating from the tree of life is that they not endure a worse consequence than death, namely eternal separation from them. They could have had physical life and spiritual death, and it would have been a far worse punishment. There would have been no redemption possible for them at that point. And therefore God removes them from the Garden of Eden in order to fulfill what he himself has already promised, namely that the seed of the woman would bruise the head of the serpent. In other words, projecting forward into the New Testament, that Jesus would bear the punishment for sin and crush the serpent in the process through his death and resurrection. Death would be undone, likewise sin. Byron's not interested in that. He's more interested in the, as it were, existential presentation of the situation from Cain's vantage point. He says, you should have taken the tree of life, and then we would not have suffered this terrible wrong. Well, that's not quite accurate. They would have suffered a far worse wrong had that not happened. But never mind. On we go. And Adam says, oh my son, blaspheme not. These are serpent's words. And then Cain, why not? The snake spoke truth. It was the tree of knowledge. It was the tree of life. Knowledge is good and life is good. And how can both be evil? Well, because life and knowledge have more than one dimension. And Byron surely would know this as well. But again, Cain is presented as having a case, and in some sense does have a case, obviously, against God, at least the way he's being portrayed here in Byron's closet drama. So that's how he begins. He won't praise God because he's going to die. Secondly, it was because not of his own actions, but because of his parents' sins. And so he's very angry about the fact that he's going to die. But on the other hand, and this is, I think, problematic for Byron to some degree, why would Cain be so angry about that fact when it follows very shortly after this that he has no idea what death is? So this, to my mind, not even engaging with the theological issues of the drama, somewhat robs it of its moral case. It's hard to have a character as strong in his sense of injustice towards something that he doesn't actually understand. Like, why are you going to be so angry about something when it's not even clear what death is to you? Which is what we soon find in Cain's own words. He doesn't actually know what death is. So as to say, why would he be so angry then if he's unclear about what it is? I'll pick it up though in line 97, because at this point Lucifer enters, and this is interesting, and to some degree Byron here builds on some of the aspects of Percy Shelley's work on The Devil and Devils, dealing with different aspects of of the devil. Namely, he's sometimes associated with a serpent, sometimes he is called Lucifer, sometimes he's called Satan, etc. And these are often connected with the same figure, but Byron chooses to disambiguate them and to present them in separate guise, and Lucifer enters in line 97. And I'll read a little bit of this exchange. Lucifer: mortal. Cain: spirit, who art thou? Master of spirits. And being so, canst thou leave them and walk with dust? Lucifer: I know the thoughts of dust, and feel for it, and with you. Cain: how? You know my thoughts? They are the thoughts of all worthy of thought. 'Tis your immortal part which speaks within you. What immortal part? Says Cain. This has not been revealed. The tree of life was withheld from us by my father's folly, while that of knowledge, by my mother's haste, was plucked too soon, and all the fruit is death. They have deceived thee, thou shalt live. So Cain is intrigued because, of course, he's being referred to here as an immortal, and yet he has understood that he has been condemned to die and therefore is mortal. So in which sense is he immortal? Lucifer goes on to explain that the immortal part of him is the spiritual part, so he might spiritually live, even if he's going to physically die. Now, this notion is also heretical and leans on a Greek and I would say Roman understanding of the soul as somehow a disembodied spiritual entity which perdures even though the body perish. And so the body is a sort of a prison house for the soul. But that's not what is meant in Christian theology by the Spirit. The Spirit is that part of us which relates to God. And so spiritual death then is being eternally cut off from the presence of God. That's what is meant by death. And the punishment of death, it is anticipated by a physical, bodily cessation of existence, but it is ultimately, more importantly, in relation to the spiritual state, being cut off from God, who is life. But at any rate, it ensues here, and as I say, Cain is intrigued by what Lucifer says. You've told me something here I haven't heard before. This has not been revealed. But Lucifer says, you have been deceived. Thou shalt live. And Cain says, I live already, but live to die. And living see no thing to make death hateful, save an innate clinging, a loathsome and yet all invincible instinct of life, which I abhor, as I despise myself, yet cannot overcome. And so I live. Would I had never lived. And then Lucifer's response, thou livest and must live forever. Think not the earth, which is thine outward covering, is existence. It will cease, and thou wilt be no less than thou art now. No less, says Cain, and why no more? Lucifer, it may be thou shalt be as we. And ye are everlasting. Are ye happy? We are mighty, said Lucifer. Are ye happy? Lucifer, no. Art thou? How should I be so? Look on me. And then Lucifer, poor clay, and thou pretendest to be wretched. Thou, Cain, I am. And thou, with all thy might, what art thou? Lucifer, one who aspired to be what made thee and would not have made thee what thou art. Ah, thou looks almost a god, and Lucifer, I am none, and having failed to be one, would be naught save what I am. He conquered, let him reign. So now, to some degree, Cain echoes, or rather Lucifer here echoes the words of Milton's Satan, that it is better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, and that the mind is its own place and in and of itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. He does not want any longer to be God as he once sought to be. So again, there's an amalgam of Milton's portrait with Byron's own extension of the themes and ideas of Paradise Lost in his portrait of Lucifer. And he is resigned to be what he is, or in fact embraces it as what he would prefer. And who is this, rather? Thy sire's maker and the earth. Now, thy sire in reference to Adam. And heavens, and all that in them is. So I've heard his seraphs sing, and so my Father saith. They say, said Lucifer, what they must sing and say, on pain of being that which I am, and thou art, of spirits and of men. And what is that, says Cain? Souls who dare use their immortality, souls who dare look the omnipotent tyrant in his everlasting face and tell him that his evil is not good. If he has made, as he saith, which I know not nor believe, but if he made us, he cannot unmake. We are immortal. Nay, he'd have us so that he may torture. Let him. He is great, but in his greatness he is no happier than we in our conflict. Goodness would not make evil, and what else hath he made? But let him sit on his vast and solitary throne, creating worlds and to make eternity less burdensome to his immense existence and unparticipated solitude. Let him crowd orb on orb. He is alone, indefinite, indissoluble tyrant. Could he but crush himself, 'twere the best boon he ever granted. But let him reign on and multiply himself in misery. Spirits and men, at least we sympathize, and suffering in concert make our pangs innumerable more endurable by the unbounded sympathy of all with all. But he, so wretched in his height, so cruel in his wretchedness, must still create and recreate. So as I say, two things here. Two claims being made about God by Lucifer here. First claim, that God creates out of a sense of an absence of something within himself. He needs to create because he is a solitary tyrant and therefore lonely. And again, this contradicts Christian theology, which presents God in tripersonal terms. So the uncreated creator, and as I say, in tripersonal in his relations, is being denied here by Lucifer and effectively by Byron and all the romantics. Actually, they all deny and misunderstand the Christian concept of God and the significance of Trinitarian theology. But secondly, that were he good, he would not have created evil. And of course, were God to have created evil, of course it would impute his goodness, because of course goodness, it would make him evil in some sense. But of course that's not the account of or at least the orthodox account of Christian theology in relation to evil. Evil is the privation of good. Evil occurs when beings freely created by God and with free wills chose something other than God. And when they chose something other than God, they chose something that was in which goodness was absent, or the ultimate goodness was absent, and so introduced a privation of goodness into the universe, privatio boni. And so once again, these charges being made by Lucifer here, whatever Byron claims to the contrary, probably reflecting his own views on the lack of goodness in God and the tyranny of God and so forth, are nothing other than heretical charges being put in the mouth of Lucifer. But on we go. So his evil is not good, and goodness would not make evil. All true, but of course misrepresenting the understanding of evil that Christian theology holds in, at least amongst its orthodox representatives. So, but all the same, I think one has to say, when reading Byron's introduction here, this is admirably done in the sense of dramatic presentation. Very interesting. The diction is appropriate. We have relatively brief exchanges between the characters. We don't have the lengthy Miltonic phrasing. We certainly don't have Wordsworth's similar sort of not only blank verse, but also the following the sort of diction of Latin writing. We have something closer to spoken English here by Byron's Cain, and therefore I think more successful in the sense of more immediately apprehensible to the audience. And as I say, I think it's rather well done simply on a literary level. But let me go on a little bit and go to line 190. That's where I'd like to pick it up again. And the context here is that Cain is speaking of what's the context here? That in response to what Lucifer has just said, you are making me think, says Cain, about things that I had thought about before but had set aside. And he is upset by the very things that Lucifer is bringing to his mind, namely that it looks like God has created evil and yet he's said to be good. It looks like God is, his motivation is not a loving motivation, but rather a needy motivation. All of these things Cain himself had thought, and now Lucifer is giving language for those. And Lucifer's response to this line of thinking is line 188, and hadst thou not been fit by thine own soul for such companionship, that like that of his sister, I would not now have stood before thee as I am. A serpent had been enough to charm ye as before. So there's a little praise being thrown to Cain here. The reason why Lucifer is appearing as an angel disfigured, as Milton describes him at any rate, rather than the guise of a serpent, is that his mind and his character are superior to that of his mother. His mother it was appropriate for her to be visited by a serpent, but for him, he needs a fallen angel. And Cain says, so you were the serpent before. He was the serpent before is what's being implied. And Cain picks that up. Didst thou tempt my mother, Lucifer? I tempt none, save with the truth. And was not the tree of knowledge? And was not the tree of life still fruitful? Did I bid her pluck them not? Did I plant things prohibited within the reach of beings' innocence, and curious by their own innocence? I would have made ye gods. And even he who thrust ye forth, so thrust ye because, quote, ye should not eat the fruits of life and become gods as we. Were these his words? They were, says Cain, and I have heard them from those who heard them in thunder. Now, one thing that strikes me that I did not bring to your attention, which needs to be brought to your attention here. It's not strictly true that the tree in the middle of the garden alongside the tree of life is the tree of knowledge, because that would suggest that there was something good in it, and that is being hinted at here by Lucifer. He put beings naturally curious and innocent in the midst of a garden, called it the tree of knowledge, and expected them not to take of it. Why would he do that? Well, it was not, strictly speaking, only the tree of knowledge. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And those 4 words that are appended to that are crucial. It wasn't just knowledge, and it wasn't, again, the way Lucifer presents it and the way Byron is presenting it in these terms is exactly the terms under which it was presented by Gnostic heretics. That by taking from the tree of the knowledge of knowledge, they thereby gained wisdom through this and brought about evil, by, of course, but also gained a sort of knowledge and wisdom which they would have otherwise lacked. But that is, again, not a correct or accurate rendering about what even happens in Genesis. They eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not just the tree of knowledge, because otherwise they've done something that seems good, and why would God forbid anything good like attaining knowledge? So again, these are subtle changes in the text that make us sympathetic to Byron's portraiture here of the grievances of Cain and the justice of the grievances. Once again, so back to this text. And he accuses, furthermore, Lucifer does, God of being the proud one. Now, pride is, in Christian understanding, a great sin of which Lucifer himself was chiefly guilty. This is the very sin which brought him down to begin with. Pride, which led him to rebel against God for referring to his son as his Messiah, at least so portrayed in Milton's Paradise Lost, Book 5, and also in Psalm 2. But Cain says, they say the serpent was a spirit, and this now takes us down another path. And again, now Byron is getting into the same sorts of discussions that Shelley was in his essay on the devil and devils, namely the association of a serpent with Lucifer, with Satan, with the devil, all of these associations, and they are not strictly the same thing. And yet Shelley accuses Christians of oversimplification and creating and constructing a view of the devil which simply doesn't exist in Scripture. Likewise, Byron weighs in on this. They say the serpent was a spirit, says Cain. Lucifer, line 215. Who saith that? It is not written so on high. The proud one will not so far falsify, though man's vast fears and little vanity would make him cast upon the spiritual nature his own low failing. The snake was the snake, no more, and yet not less than those he tempted, in nature being earth also, more in wisdom, since he could overcome them, and foreknew the knowledge fatal to their narrow joys. Think'st thou I'd take the shape of things that die? But the thing had a demon, said Cain. Now, the reference to a demon here is, again, as Shelley avers to in On the Devil and Devils, the word demon or daimon in Greek refers to a tutelary spirit. So it's used in Plato and commonly in Greek writing of the day, and not in reference to any spiritually malign force, but rather to a tutelary figure that guides the actions and thoughts of figures. Philip Pullman makes a great deal of this in his Dark Materials series, where everyone has a daimon, a spiritual being which is attached to the body of an individual in some ways, sort of reviving, I would say, Gnostic ideas of human nature, for that matter. But Cain's the thing that is the serpent had a demon, because he's saying, but the implied problem here is, but the serpent spoke, right? So how is that possible? The thing had a demon. He but woke one in those he spake to with his forky tongue. I tell thee that the serpent was no more than a mere serpent. Ask the cherubim who guard the tempting tree. When 1,000 ages have rolled over your dead ashes and your seeds, the seed of the then world may thus array their earliest faults in fable, and attribute to me a shape I scorn, as I scorn all that bows to him who made things but to bend before his sullen soul eternity. But we who see the truth must speak it. Thy fond parents listened to a creeping thing and fell. For what should spirits tempt them? What was there to envy in the narrow bounds of paradise, that spirits who pervade space? But I speak to thee of what thou knowest not, with all thy tree of knowledge. So now he's referring to a place that he will take him in Act 2, namely a space from which the vantage point, infinite distance, to look down on the earth and its smallness and so forth. But all of this, he is going to, again, he's delving in poetic terms with the very sorts of things that Shelley has explored in On the Devil and Devils. That there's a conflation of various figures together in the form of the snake, the devil, Lucifer, Satan, etc., as if they were the same being. And the response here of Lucifer is, this is not so. That will be a later addition. So using Byron's, following Byron's lead here. Pick it back up. So he had a tutelary spirit, and then the question, 247, from Lucifer: darest thou look on death? He has not yet been seen, says Cain. Now the assumption here on Cain's part is that death will be a person, a figure, in the same way that Milton portrays death in Paradise Lost, for instance, but this will be a figure. And he has not been seen yet at all. And Lucifer's response, which is more accurate, but must be undergone. My father says he's something dreadful, says Cain, and my mother weeps when he's named. And Abel lifts his eyes to heaven, and Zillah casts hers to the earth and sighs a prayer, and Ada looks on me and speaks not. And thou, Cain, thoughts unspeakable crowd in my breast to burning. When I hear of this almighty death, who is, it seems, inevitable. Could I wrestle with him? I wrestled with the lion when a boy in play till he ran roaring from my grip. It has no shape, says Lucifer, but will absorb all things that bear the form of earth-born being. Now, Lucifer here describes death in terms that are not dissimilar to those of Milton in Paradise Lost, book 2, line 666, where death is called a shape, if shape it might be called, which shape had none, by which Milton is trying to talk about death and sin in negation terms. He's the absence of good, is an absence of shape, is an absence of being, or the privation of these things. Lucifer here is misrepresenting it to some degree, but also following along the lines that Milton draws, and again referred to in that work earlier, which we addressed on the course, Edmund Burke's Portrait of the Sublime, where he particularly cited that passage here, and I have no doubt that Byron has read Burke's treatise on the sublime here, or the origins of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, because his portrait here throughout is sublime. From the beginning to the end, we can see sublimity about this literary portrait here. But it has no shapes, says Lucifer, that is death, but will absorb all things that bear the form of earth-born being. Ah, says Cain, I thought it was a being who could do such evil things to beings, save a being. Ask the destroyer, says Lucifer. Who? The maker. Call him which name thou wilt. He makes but to destroy. I knew not that, yet thought it, since I heard of death. Although I know not what it is, yet it seems horrible. I have looked out in the vast desolate night in search of him, and when I saw gigantic shadows in the umbrage of the walls of heaven, checkered by the far flashing of the cherubs' swords, I watched for what I thought his coming. For with fear rose longing in my heart to know what 'twas which shook us all, but nothing came. And then I turned my weary eyes from off our native and forbidden paradise up to the lights above us in the azure, which are so beautiful. Shall they, too, die? Lucifer, perhaps, but long outlive both thine and thee. I am glad of that, said Cain. I would not have them die, They are so lovely. What is death? I fear, I feel, it is a dreadful thing, but what I cannot compass. 'Tis denounced against us, both them who sinned and sinned not, as an ill. What ill? He wants the answer here from Lucifer. Give me an answer. You seem to know more than I do on this front. Lucifer's very, very happy to provide answers to him. And Lucifer's response, to be resolved into the earth. But shall I know it? As I know not death, said Lucifer, I cannot answer. Were I quiet earth, that were no evil. Would I ne'er had been aught else but dust. So this is being presented in some ways by Cain, I think, in Byron's rendering, as a benign wish not to exist at all. But of course, it's denying the goodness of simply being. And again, this sense of that is conveyed, which I find difficult not to imagine as Byron's own conjectures, that he would be satisfied with not being at all. But that's not all that is presented here. And Lucifer upbraids him for this acceptance of the state of death. Lucifer says, that is a groveling wish, less than thy father's, for he wished to know. But not to live, said Cain, or wherefore plucked he not the life tree? He was hindered. Deadly error, said Cain, not to snatch first that fruit. But ere he plucked the knowledge, he was ignorant of death. Alas, I scarcely know now what it is, and yet I fear it. Fear I know not what. And I, said Lucifer, who know all things, fear nothing. See what is true knowledge. Wilt thou teach me all, said Cain? Aye, but on one condition. Name it. That thou fallst down and worship me, thy Lord. Cain, thou art not the Lord my father worships. No. His equal? No. I have naught in common with him, nor would. I would be aught above, beneath, aught save a sharer or a servant of his power. I dwell apart, but I am great. Many there are who worship me, and more who shall. Be thou among the first. And Cain, I never as yet have bowed unto my father's God, although my brother Abel oft implores that I should join him with him in sacrifice. Why should I bow to thee? Hast thou ne'er bowed to him? Have I not said it? Need I say it? Could not thy mighty knowledge teach thee that? Note the proud spirit of Cain here throughout. He's a sort of a foil for Lucifer, and Byron's portrait of Cain here is of a magnificent character, in character comparable to Lucifer, only different in his nature because he's not an angel, but still is willing to speak in such terms. And the refusal here to bow. Why should I bow? I didn't bow to God. Why would I bow to you? And then Lucifer, he who bows not to him has bowed to me, but I will bend to neither. Nevertheless, thou art my worshipper, said Lucifer. Not worshipping him makes thee mine the same. Now in this, I think he actually speaks accurately. If one does not worship God, one does worship his adversary, Satan. And it's interesting that Byron acquaints his literary figure Cain of this fact. But Cain responds, and what is that? Thou know here and hereafter Let me be but taught the mystery of my being. So now again, the mystery is referred to. What is the mystery? Who am I? And Lucifer says, follow where I will lead thee. So it's interestingly, he's being now led not on a path of love, or not on a path of relationship per se, but on a path of a knowledge, and it's a growing knowledge. And the knowledge that he's going to lead him to in Act 2 is a knowledge of the origins of the earth, along the lines of the presentation, the catastrophism of Cuvier and the natural theologians in France. Now, those explain the earth and natural history in terms of a series of catastrophic events, and like akin to those of Noah's flood. Now, though in France, those were popular and influential. In Britain, they took more the form of a gradual evolutionary term of progress, because it was believed that this was more compatible with Christianity. And I find that rather interesting, given the light of contemporary creationist, evolutionist debates, that it is evolution itself, which was believed by those in the Christian camp, that was compatible with Christianity. And I would beg to differ there. And it's very interesting, however, that even amongst the the paleontologists in the Cuvier model, there are alternatives to the gradual development hypothesis, namely that of Cuvier, the catastrophism approach to things. As I say, Cuvier is interpreted on the continent, or rather in England, rather different. So you move away from the flood geology of Cuvier to the glacial model there, and that's where we are to some degree to this day. But I think the original hypothesis, which is the one that Byron is entertaining here of Cuvier, suggests a rather different understanding of the Earth's origins, and we'll come to that in Act 2, where he sees a series of death happening before Adam and Eve, whole civilizations brought down to naught. But I will get to that. But that is exactly where Lucifer is about to lead Cain at this point. So he says, let me but be taught the mystery of my being. And Lucifer says, follow where I will lead thee. And Cain says, but I must retire to till the earth, for I had promised. Lucifer, what? To cull some first fruits. Why? To offer up with Abel on an altar. And then Lucifer, saidst thou not, thou ne'er hadst bent to him who made thee? Yes. But Abel's earnest prayer has wrought upon me, said Cain. The offering is more his than mine, and Ada, why dost thou hesitate? Cain, she is my sister, born on the same day, of the same womb, and she wrung from me with tears this promise. And rather than see her weep, I would, methinks, bear all, and worship aught. Then follow me. I will. Okay. And note that Byron here presents her as his sister. He doesn't present her as his wife. Now, both are true here, but because his sister is his wife. But note that in Byron's presentation, he repeatedly uses the word is going to suggest the incestuous relationship. And this is, of course, intentional and provocative as such, as Byron always is. And again, would lead the reader to think that, again, he is talking about his own just claims scandalously against the idea of incest that are now dominant in his society. And he'll pick that up later on here. So when Ada enters the scene here, who is his wife, and they have a little child by the name of Enoch, she speaks to him in similar terms. Ada enters. My brother, I have come for thee. It is our hour of rest and joy, and we have less without thee. Thou hast labored not this morn, but I have done thy task. The fruits are ripe, and glowing as a light which ripens. Come away. seest thou not? I see an angel. She says, I do see an angel. We have seen many. Will he share our rest? Will he share our hour of rest? He is welcome. But he is not like the angels we have seen. Are there then others, says Ada? But he is welcome, as they were. They deigned to be our guests. Will he? And then Cain to Lucifer, wilt thou? I ask thee to be mine. I must away with him. So now we get the tug between Ada and Lucifer. Now this is going to dominate the rest of the discussion here. We'll go on for a few hundred lines. Cain has made a choice to follow Lucifer, and that means being parted from Ada here. I must away with him. And leave us, says Ada? I. And me, beloved Ada, let me go with thee. No, she must not. Ada, who art thou that steppest between heart and heart? Cain, he is a god. How knowest thou? He speaks like a god. And Ada, so did the serpent, and it lied. Thou errest, Ada, was not the tree that of knowledge? And the answer is, no, it was not. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But never mind. I, to our eternal sorrow, as I think Milton Satan says, yes, it was the tree of knowledge, knowledge of good lost and evil got. I, to our eternal sorrow, now Lucifer, and yet that grief is knowledge. So he lied not. And if he did not betray you, 'twas with truth. And truth in its own essence cannot be but good. Now this is true, but note how he's misrepresented even the nature of what has happened here. But truth in its own essence cannot be but good. So lots of discussion here on Byron's part of the theological themes, the metaphysical themes that we also see articulated in Paradise Lost. And with that, then, if we compare and contrast Milton's account with Byron's, we can see Byron's account as falling within the same mold and engaging with those ideas, clearly in terms that are heretical to Christian truth, but nonetheless presented in a, I think, quite interesting and appealing comparison. But I'll carry on just a little bit longer. Because what it will, where shall I go? So this dichotomy here between truth and knowledge. If it's true, then it must be knowledge, and if it's true, then it must be good. And so we can't call it evil if it remains to be true. And so evil is not per se. Evil is simply an arbitrary category which God uses to punish, and he does so out of the ill motivations of his solitary spirit, etc., etc. This is the gist of the charges that are being made repeatedly by God. And Lucifer will front them. And of course, Byron is safe to some degree in presenting these in the coming from the mouth of Lucifer, because what should Lucifer do other than malign God? But as we can see, in some ways, unlike Milton's Satan, Lucifer here is far more of a sympathetic character for us, and represents something of not only Byron's own views, but also of his figure of Cain. They're two of a kind. But Ada's response to this: but all we know of it has gathered evil on ill, expulsion from our home, and dread, and toil, and sweat, and heaviness, remorse of that which was, and hope of that which cometh not. Cain, walk not with this spirit, bear with what we have borne, and love me, I loveth thee. Lucifer, more than thy mother and thy sire? I do. Is that a sin too? No, said Lucifer, not yet. It one day will be in your children. Now, again, this is the ironic appeal to loving Cain in a sexual sense. It's not a sin to love him more, as in a way differently than she is relating to her father and mother. She has a sexual relationship with Cain. So it's not a sin, but it will be in your children. So in other words, it's an arbitrary social designation rather than inherently a sinful act. So again, Byron is implicitly justifying the sin with which he is accused of perpetrating with his half-sister Augusta Lee. No, not yet. It will one day be in your children. What, says Ada, must not my daughter love her brother Enoch? Not as thou lovest Cain. Oh my God! Shall they not love and bring forth things that love out of their love? Have they not drawn their milk out of this bosom? Was not he their father, born of the same soul womb in the same hour with me? Did we not love each other, and in multiplying our being multiply things which will love each other as we love them? And as I love thee, my Cain, go not forth with this spirit. He is not of ours. Lucifer, the sin I speak of is not of my making, and cannot be a sin in you, whate'er it seem in those who will replace ye in mortality. What is the sin which is not sin in itself? Can circumstance make sin or virtue? If it doth, we are slaves of Lucifer. Higher things than ye are slaves, and higher than them, or ye would be so. Did they not prefer an independency of torture to the smooth agonies of adulation, in hymns and harpings and self-seeking prayers to that which is omnipotent, because it is omnipotent, and not from love, but terror and self-hope? Ada, omnipotence must be all goodness. Was it so in Eden? Fiend, said Ada, tempt me not with beauty. Thou art fairer than was the serpent, and as false. As true, said Lucifer. Ask Eve your mother, bears she not the knowledge of good and evil? O my mother, thou hast plucked a fruit more fatal to thine offspring than to thyself. Thou at the least hast passed thy youth in paradise, in innocent and happy intercourse with happy spirits. But we, thy children, ignorant of Eden, are girt about by demons, who assume the words of God and tempt us with our own dissatisfied and curious thoughts, as thou wert worked on by the snake in thy most flushed and heedless, harmless wantonness of bliss. I cannot answer this immortal being that stands before me. I cannot abhor him. I look upon him with a pleasing fear, and yet I fly not from him. In his eye there is a fastening attraction which fixes my fluttering eyes on his. My heart beats quick. He awes me and yet draws me near. Nearer and nearer. Cain, Cain, save me from him, etc., etc. So what we get here, and I'm going to finish off with this here, is the portrait of Satan, of God as again, this monad, absent of love, absent of relationship in his own being, creating not only the world, but also destroying it, and destroying it out of a sense of arbitrariness and injustice. All of that, the composite portrait is to present God in the most unflattering manner, and to present not only Cain in his moody, melancholic, dark spirit as a admirable figure and a just figure, but likewise presenting Lucifer in similar such terms. And so with this, we have the humanist portrait of a take on Paradise Lost, or at least the themes of Paradise Lost in Lord Byron's work, in forms that we have not yet encountered, but which have a power to them, and I think a literary merit which we, I think, does not exist in certainly some of the others. But again, it's far more directly opposed to Milton's theology, but nonetheless it is a theological take, and there can be no mistake about it. As I say, when it was published, the publisher, John Murray, faced strong backlash, and certainly there was talk of censorship of it, and of course the references to incest only added to it. But the theological tenor of the epic was immediately recognized, and its opposition to Christianity was also identified. And I think rightly so, and I've given you some reasons why. I think Byron's claims certainly do not comport with Christian views, but nonetheless could be confused by those who are ignorant, as perhaps Byron himself was. But I think nonetheless it is a great work, and we will return to it in the next lecture looking at Acts 2 and 3. But we'll leave it for that for now.